Friday the 13th, Church of the Divine Psychopath, an original novel by Scott Phillips. Chapter 2. The bullet punched into Rector's face at the inner corner of his left eye, shattering his nose and skidding off the inside of his skull before erupting from the back of his head just behind the right ear. Most of Rector's college education went with it. The slug stung Captain Walter Hobbs' neck as it whizzed past. Chunks of Rector's brain, seasoned with bits of skull and pieces of the Kevlar helmet, struck Hobbs's face and bulletproof vest with a sickening splat. Hobbs staggered backwards, hand to his neck. He quickly withdrew it, looking for blood. The amount of gore made him feel woozy. The remaining members of Hobbs' strike team had found cover and were awaiting orders before Rector's body had even hit the ground. A massive hand clamped down on Hobbs' shoulder, steadying and pushing him to his knees in one motion. Hobbs tried to look back, but his head was shoved roughly to the side as his hulking second-in-command examined the wound on his neck. Jeff Townsend squinted one eye and looked a little closer at the ragged, inch-long slit on Hobbs' neck. "You ain't even bleeding enough to swell a tampon. Most of it's Rector." He released the grip on Hobbs and peered through the trees towards the house where the shot came from. Hobbs gaped at the human slab of beef kneeling beside him. Townsend topped out at 6'6" and was so bulky he had to have his uniforms custom made. Hobbs felt as if he were hunkered down beside a small car. Someone in the house let out a loud whoop, and a hailstorm of automatic weapons fire punched into the trees around the strike team. Hobbs and Townsend split, rolling in opposite directions to find cover. "Element 1, sustain fire!" Hobbs shouted, coming up on one knee. "Element 2, flank!" The 6 operators that made up Element 2 immediately peeled off to join Hobbs and Townsend. The remaining 8 men held their positions and opened up with their Heckler G36K rifles. 5.56 caliber slugs hammered into the house, sending chunks of tastefully painted trim and red brick shrapnel into the air. "I'd say we had some faulty intel," Townsend wryly suggested. Hobbs couldn't agree more. It was supposed to be a walk in the park. A bunch of yuppie assholes who fancied themselves as badass drug dealers, holed up in the woods, cooking up a shitload of meth and trying to keep the stuff off their Italian loafers. They weren't supposed to have automatic weapons, and they sure as hell weren't supposed to blow the brain out of one of Hobbs's men. His first command was officially fucked. Of course, it was no surprise, considering his luck had always leaned a little left to the side of lousy. It began when he sucked up a healthy load of his mom's genes, which set him up with soap opera star good looks, but left him with the full height of 5'6" and the physique of an Auschwitz survivor. Needless to say, he spent many a school day with some bigger kid holding him down and scuffing his stunning cheekbones into the dirt while punching him in the kidneys. Hobbs's mom always said they were jealous. With her thick Czech accent, it came out more like, "Don't mind them, they choose jealous." But Hobbs never felt like he offered much for anybody to be jealous of. The muscle he carried now came from hard work and a wicked, stubborn streak. The same went for his position on the strike team, and he was goddamned if a bunch of rich cocksuckers were going to rob him of it. Hobbs rattled off a series of hand signals to his men, his lips pressed tightly together in a cartoon-style frown. With all the gunfire and bullets flying around him, he realized he might as well have yelled the commands. Smoke drifted through the trees, stirred by the motion of Hobbs's men, as Element 2 hustled their equipment-laden asses into a flanking position. The house was about 40 yards away, surrounded on all sides by forest. The trees cleared in a wide ring around the building itself, which meant no cover for that 60 or so feet. Before Hobbs's strike team had added the bullet holes to its decor, the house had been a pleasant 2-story number, the kind of home you'd see in a photograph above the caption, "Childhood Home of President Take Your Pick." That particular photo probably wouldn't include the 4 high-end SUVs and the Jaguar XJS that were parked in a neat row out front, however. Reaching a point about 90 degrees from Element 1's position, Hobbs brought Element 2 to a halt with yet another hand signal and brought his binoculars to his eyes. Townsend knelt nearby and unsheathed a short-barreled shotgun. Hobbs weighed their options. The men were directly across from the north side of the house. One window downstairs, 2 up, and what appeared to be a service door, probably leading to a laundry room or basement stairs. Busting through that door and finding themselves at the top of a stairwell with gunmen below would be, to put it mildly, problematic. The front door was currently taking fire from Element 1, which left the back door, or wall breach, for entry. That service door seemed the best bet. All they had to do was get to it. The first shots had come from the ground floor, but Hobbs could clearly see muzzles flashes from one of the upper story windows at the front of the house as well. Amazing. He had expected them to cave in when the H&Ks erupted with machine gun fire. There was no sign of anyone at the north windows, and none of the fire was directed in Element 2's direction, so Hobbs assumed they'd managed to avoid being seen as they flanked the house. A squeal of pain split the cacophony of gunshots, and a yuppie toppled halfway out one of the second-story windows at the front of the house, his body catching in the torn remains of the screen and dangling. Through the binoculars, Hobbs noted that the slug had caught the fellow squarely in the face. What was left looked like hamburger with a hip hairstyle. The medical examiner would need the corpse's dental records for its identification. At Hobbs's shoulder, Townsend grinned. One dead yuppie meant that there was from 7 to 13 men left in the house. If Hobbs could rely on that part of the intel any better than the report stating that they weren't armed to the teeth with automatic weapons. Time to get the job done. Hobbs's hand whipped through the air again, and Element 2 moved out, leaving the relative safety of the trees by darting into the clearing. Moving in a V formation, each man leapfrogged the one ahead of him, running up a few yards and kneeling in a firing position to cover the next man who moved up. Quickly, Element 2 closed the distance between the trees and the house. Hobbs wished the yuppie fucks had parked their cars on the side of the house where they could be used for cover. He soothed himself with the knowledge that the overly expensive vehicles were being peppered with bullets. There was movement at one of the windows upstairs. The barrel of Hobbs's G36K snapped up, zeroing in on the figure behind the curtains. The other team members kept moving. Hobbs waited for the curtains to part, waited to see a gun leveled at him. In his head, he ticked off the remaining distance to the house and the speed of his men, not willing to look away from the target above him. The first of his men should be reaching the house by now, stacking along the wall. Don't tell me this guy's not even going to look out the window, Hobbs thought. The fucker looked out the window. Hobbs' finger gently squeezed the trigger and released it. One round left the rifle's barrel and penetrated the glass with a deceptively tiny cracking sound. The spinning bullet took the curtain with it as it entered and exited from the yuppie's body. With a crescendo of artificial splatter and blood flowing freely from his chest, the yuppie staggered back, twitched, and then dropped. "Holy shit!" somebody in the house yelled. By then, Hobbs had already sprinted to the wall, coming up alongside Townsend outside the service door. A gun barrel smashed through what was left of the window pane above. As shards of shattered glass fell on them, one of Hobbs's men put a 3-round burst into the general vicinity of the unseen gunman. Hobbs pulled a flashbang grenade from his vest pouch and nodded to Townsend. The big man shoved the muzzle of his shotgun against the doorknob and fired, shredding the doorknob and the bolt. Hobbs kicked the door in, tossed the flashbang inside, and turned away as the explosive went off, instantly followed by a few startled yelps and screams from inside. That's always good to hear. The suppressing fire from Element 1 ceased once the building had been breached. The yuppies were still hollering in confusion as Hobbs and Townsend entered the house. Through the haze, Hobbs glimpsed the back of a man fleeing the room through another doorway. He then put 3 rounds into the chest of a second yuppie that was stunned, but frantically waving around a big handgun. Gore spouted from the yuppie's chest as he tumbled backwards over another victim who was down on his knees, clawing at his eyes in pain. The blinded yuppie shrieked like a 3-year-old being dragged out of Chuck E. Cheese. Hobbs and Townsend ran the walls on either side of the door, coming to a stop at opposite corners. The room was about 10 feet by 10, larger than Hobbs had anticipated, although he noticed he was right about the basement stairs, as a door was slightly ajar, a light flickering below. The doorway the yuppie had fled through appeared to lead to the kitchen. Not much in the room besides the screaming yuppie, the dead yuppie, and 2 large garbage cans, both filled with fast food trash, frozen dinner trays, and beer bottles. And Hobbs bitterly noted, a brand he could rarely afford to drink. 2 more operators entered the house, Meister and Koto, crisscrossing to the far corners of the room. As they covered the entry/exit points, Hobbs made his way to the basement door and tossed another flash grenade down the stairs. Hobbs was already moving to the remaining doorway as the grenade detonated. No screams this time, though. So Hobb put another flashbang through the kitchen doorway. A second later, a muted thump was immediately followed by a hell of a lot of shrieking from within. The remainder of the strike team was entering the house and moving into position as Hobbs swept into the kitchen, Townsend close on his heels. The unfortunate yuppie in the kitchen must have snatched up the flashbang, hoping to throw it back. He held his clawed hands in front of him. Bloody strips of scorched beef jerky, flesh dangling from the bones. Ribbons of blood ran down his forearms. A wailing, high-pitched scream flowed from his gaping mouth, breaking off as he saw the two men enter the kitchen. The severely wounded yuppie suddenly flung himself at Hobb, shredded hands twisted into gore, dripping talons. A load of double-aught buck from Townsend's shotgun put a scattered assortment of large holes in the yuppie's torso, sending him hurtling back across the kitchen. Meister appeared in the doorway behind Hobb and Townsend. A muzzle flash lit up through the smoke as automatic weapon fire erupted from the next room. Hobb and Townsend dove for cover, bullets tearing up the fine cabinetry in the kitchen. Meister collapsed to the floor between the men, a stream of blood pulsing from the wound in his neck. Townsend sent 2 rounds from his shotgun in the general direction of the incoming fire, satisfied by the screech of distress and cessation of gunfire that followed. Sliding through the deepening pool of Meister's blood, Hobb bent to check the man's condition. The bullet had found an artery. It had only taken seconds for most of the blood in Meister's body to relocate to the kitchen floor. "Son of a bitch," Hobb muttered. Somebody had set his team up to take a beating. Hobb pulled a flashbang and tossed it into the room where the gunfire had come from. He turned away to await the explosion, and after a satisfying volley of screaming, turned back to enter the room. Then his bad luck really kicked in. A flash-blinded yuppie bolted from the smoke, wildly swinging a baseball bat and screaming like a pissed-off teenage girl. The business end of the bat nailed Hobb dead in the right eye. Stumbling backwards, he slipped in the sticky pool of blood and dropped to the kitchen floor, his head thudding off the tile. Hobb stared up at the blurred ceiling above him. He could hear faraway popping sounds like he was screaming and dreaming of the 4th of July. Someone in black knelt next to him, lifting his head and peering closely in his eyes while speaking a language he couldn't quite place. People were shouting, somewhere or everywhere, from the sound of it. Hobbs's hands went to his eyes, trying to clear his vision. When he touched the balloon full of blood and roofing nails that used to be his right eye, the ceiling flashed white hot and he was sucked backwards into darkness. It was weird. Nearly all the members of Father Long's congregation were milling around the church's parking lot, but there wasn't a single car parked there. Kelly watched the others chatter excitedly, grinning with anticipation and religious fervor. Their suitcases were lined up neatly along the front wall of the building, 1 small bag per person, just as Long had told them. Kelly glanced down at the little gym bag she held. It contained a few changes of simple clothes, suitable for work and for play. Long had suggested that she does this, but she'd make a point of including her favorite just-a-hair-too-tight wife-beater t-shirt and shorts that revealed the tiniest hint of sexy butt cheek. Inappropriate, she supposed, but as a means to an end, that was just what the doctor ordered. Well, she hoped so anyway. Kelly chewed her lower lip nervously. She should probably put her bag with the rest of them and join the other members of the group. Instead, she considered fleeing, just turning tail and running like hell, not looking back and never giving Long another thought. Yeah, like that happened. Kelly not thinking about Long would be like a teenage boy not thinking about Britney Spears. The man had the corpse of Jason Voorhees strapped to a cross. Where would you come into possession of such a thing? It's not like they auction off the bodies of dead mass murderers down at the state fair. It was a prop, a dummy. Maybe one of the congregation decked out in a Halloween costume? A really high-quality Halloween costume? Just add maggots? And what about that awful smell? It wasn't Jason Voorhees, and this wasn't the same damn argument Kelly had been having with herself for the last 2 days. The one that had been raging within her, even as the toothless guy at the shitty used car dealership had stuffed $300 into her hand. A good price for her Honda, he'd said, especially considering the shape it was in. Or when she sold her furniture to the second-hand shop, even her favorite super comfy old recliner, the one she liked to curl up in when it was cold and drink hot chocolate and think about finding a decent guy. And by the time she was donating most of her clothes to the Salvation Army, She very nearly believed what she was telling herself. It wasn't Jason Voorhees. Long was making a point somehow, using a representation of something horrible to teach his followers a lesson about the Word of God. Christ! She didn't even believe in God, but somehow she made herself believe in Long, so that she had performed her duty as a member of the ministry, just as the others obviously had. She'd sold off her worldly possessions and had come here to take the next step. Sighing, Kelly started across the parking lot. She hoped Long wouldn't mind that she was wearing the little powder blue, flower print sundress. She had fully intended to sell it before remembering that the Reverend had once complimented her on the way it flattered her figure. A comment like that had to mean the man of God had a little of the devil in him. "Kelly!" The delighted squeal erupted from an exuberant 17-year-old girl bouncing across the parking lot in Kelly's direction. "Hey, Meredith," Kelly smiled wide, trying to get into the spirit of things. Meredith Host had imprinted on Kelly during her first visit to the church, latching onto her as sort of a big sister figure. What a brilliant idea that was, Kelly thought. If it weren't for the ministry, she probably would have had the teenage out drinking and getting laid. Not that Kelly had been very successful in recent months when it came to the latter. Giggling furiously, Meredith leapt skyward one last time, flinging her arms around Kelly and squeezing the living hell out of her. Her braided red pigtails slapped Kelly's cheeks as the girl wriggled against her. Over Meredith's head, Kelly smiled at the teenager's parents. Her dad had to be in his early 60s, her mom close on his heels. Kelly wondered if Meredith was a little accident conceived in a night of unbridled godliness, regretted the following morning by the couple. Come to think of it, Meredith really didn't look much like her dad. Maybe the mom did some partying back in the day? Was there a little of the milkman in young Meredith? I am such an asshole, Kelly thought, admonishing herself. The hosts were nice people, and they were always good to her. They deserved a little respect in return. Releasing her death grip on Kelly, Meredith bopped around from foot to foot, looking for all the world like she might have wet her pants. "Isn't it cool?" she squeaked. "I can't believe we're finally going." "I know. It's crazy," Kelly said. When she was 17, she wouldn't have had the least bit of interest in ridding herself of her possessions and running off to some commune, unless said commune involved lots of dope and deep dicking. And even then, she wouldn't have given up her Cure albums. Didn't it sting a little when you had to sell your stuff, though? Meredith stopped bouncing and fixed Kelly with a funny look, like a dog trying to figure out what's on television. "We didn't have to sell anything. We chose to, because we love Father Long." A smile spread across her face. "And God." The girl's excited hopping began again. Kelly stared at her for a moment, forcing a smile of her own. "It's a good thing she's got the Lord," Kelly pondered, trying not to watch Meredith's pert breast as she danced around. The girl grabbed Kelly's wrist, tugging at her. "Come on, come on, come on!" Kelly stumbled along as Meredith led her across the parking lot. "You're going to break my neck," she laughed. Meredith was dragging her towards her parents and the rest of the congregation, but Kelly used her slightly larger body like a rudder to change the girl's course. Wait, I've got to put my suitcase with the others." Laughing, Meredith veered off towards the row of luggage, still hauling Kelly along. Though she wasn't quite sure what inspired it in the first place, Kelly enjoyed the attention the girl heaped upon her. After all, the kind of attention she was accustomed to usually involved screaming, physical abuse, and the occasional cup of coffee being flung at her. Maybe being a big sister wouldn't be so bad after all. Kelly dropped her gym bag with the rest of the luggage and lifted the strap off her sundress, which had dropped dangerously low during the run. "Look, I've almost made my boob fall out," Meredith laughed, impishly poking Kelly's left breast with her index finger. "Hey!" Kelly yelped, looking around shyly. "Meredith, what would your parents think if they saw you do that?" The girl shrugged theatrically with a goofy grin on her face. "Besides, yours aren't so small either," Kelly pointed out. She went to jab Meredith's breast, and the girl dodged away, crossing her arms in front of herself. "Come on." Kelly threw an arm around Meredith's shoulders, and the two walked over to join the others. Meredith's parents greeted Kelly enthusiastically, with friendly hugs and smooches on her cheek. She instantly felt like a complete jerk for questioning the circumstances of Meredith's birth. Mr. Host looked around at the blue sky overhead, his pudgy, wrinkled face radiating happiness. His wispy white hair blew around in the soft breeze. "Today is a good day," he began, his smile settling on Kelly. We're starting over again, all of us. How many people are given that opportunity? Bless Father Long, Mrs. Host interjected. From the practiced way she said it, Kelly got the impression that the sentence was her only contribution to many recent discussions. A good man indeed, Mr. Host added. It couldn't have been Jason Voorhees. It simply couldn't have. Otherwise, somebody else would have been freaked out like Kelly was. But looking around, all she saw were big smiles and happy people who had just sold everything they owned on the orders of the man they believed would lead their souls to the promised land. She fought down the urge to ask Meredith's parents what they thought about the thing, or whatever it was that had been bound to that cross. After the way Meredith had reacted to her comment about selling everything, it didn't seem like such a good idea to bring it up. Again, the desire to get the hell out of there tugged at her. I want to sit next to you on the bus, okay? Meredith asked. Kelly realized she'd been holding her breath. Like I'd let you sit anywhere else, she said, giving the girl a playful shove. Boobs of a feather, Meredith said, shooting a sly glance at her parents. Kelly's eyes widened. Say what? Her father asked, cupping a hand to his ear. I said Kelly and me are birds of a feather, Daddy, Meredith giggled. Smiling, Mr. Host looked from his daughter to Kelly. She struggled to contain her laughter. I believe you are at that, the old man proudly stated. A hell of a lot of racket saved Kelly any further embarrassment. Everyone turned as a rattle-trap old school bus pulled into the parking lot, engine growling, and just about everything else squeaking or clanking. The name of whatever school district the bus once served had been scraped off, replaced by the words, Ministry of the Heavenly Vessel, stenciled in garlish red over the yellow paint. A cheer went up from the congregation. Kelly didn't share their enthusiasm, however. The arrival of the bus only drove home the feeling that she had stepped off a cliff a few hours back and was merely waiting for the impact when she hit the bottom. Following close behind the bus was the old primer gray pickup truck belonging to Curtis Rickles. The truck towed some kind of generator or air compressor or something. Kelly wasn't sure what it was, but it was a good-sized piece of equipment. Probably meant there was a lot of work to be done at the congregation's new digs. The school bus came to a halt, its various unpleasant sounds ceasing a moment or two afterwards, as if running to catch up with the vehicle. Kelly hung back as everyone crowded excitedly around the bus. The door folded open and Eric Long stepped into view, beaming at his followers with a smile that would have made Charlton Heston feel inadequate. Another boisterous cheer rose from the crowd and they pushed in closer, those near enough reaching out to lay hands on Long, some patting him affectionately, others just wanting to touch the man. Kelly couldn't help it. She wanted to touch him too. Breaking into a smile, she ran the short distance to the bus and waded into the group. Shouldering her way through, she forced herself to the front and looked up at Long, her smile melting into a shy little grin. Something fluttered in her stomach as he met her gaze. His eyes still locked on Kelly as he addressed the congregation. What are you all standing around for, waiting on a bus? Kelly joined in the delighted laughter. Are you going somewhere? Long asked, drawing it out and obviously enjoying every second of it. His eyes finally flicked away from Kelly's. The crowd's voices went up as one. With you! More laughter and cheering followed. The preacher stepped down from the bus, gesturing towards the vehicle. It's not pretty, but it'll get us there. It's beautiful, Mr. Host said. Long craned his neck to see the row of luggage, which was all that remained of his followers' belongings. His smile faded, replaced by an expression of humble gratitude. You've all sacrificed so much for this, for our future. Prompted by this, Mr. Host pulled an overstuffed envelope from his shirt pocket and offered it to Long. Kelly saw that it was full of cash. Her own envelope was pathetically thin in comparison. The family really had sold everything, all the belongings they'd collected throughout their considerable years. How much emotional value was attached to some of those personal belongings? How fat would that envelope be? Father Long held up a hand. When we reach our destination, he smiled at Mr. Host as the old man nodded and returned the envelope to his pocket. It'll all go in the pot then. There's a lot of hard work, a lot of sweat ahead of us before that house can be called a home. He turned slowly, his gaze seemingly falling on each and every one of his followers. But with your contributions, your sacrifices, We will create a community of the Lord where all of us can live in accordance with His teachings, where we can be free, where we can prosper, where we can raise our children in a morally substantial environment. His eyes flicked to Kelly for the slightest instant, then darted away again. Wait, was that glance meant to be meaningful? And if it was, how? Was Long hinting at the possibility of engaging in a little procreation with her? Or was he giving her a gentle slap on the wrist for her morally bankrupt past? A handful of praises and amens went up from the congregation, but even as Long's words stirred something within her, made her feel a sense of unity with the good flesh of those around her. Kelly's ever-present guilt gnawed within the base of her skull. For God's sake, she wanted to sleep with this man. No, that was too polite a way to put it. What would the host think of her? Hell, what would Meredith think of her if they knew the lustful thoughts she was having towards their spiritual leader? Tearing her eyes from Long, Kelly looked around herself, abashed. These people were true believers, honest-to-God keepers of the faith. She was a traitor in their midst, someone who wanted to drag this good man down with her, to her sordid depravity. She didn't deserve to be among them. She should be on a psychiatrist's couch. Thanks, Mom, Kelly seethed. Thanks for every goddamn thing. Our children, because we're all children of God, Kelly heard Long say as she snapped back to the moment at hand. Except some of us need to stand in the corner, she wanted to say. Long's impromptu sermon was interrupted as another vehicle arrived, this time a faded red 1960s-era International Scout, hauling a 15-foot enclosed trailer. Kelly might have had doubts earlier, still had them to an extent, but at least it was obvious Long wasn't pissing away everyone's money on expensive cars. She watched as the Scout pulled to a stop and Don James climbed out. James was another of Long's inner circle, a buff biker in his late 20s, solidly muscular without being ripped, his beefy arms drenched in tattoos. Some of them looked to Kelly to be of the jailhouse variety, meaning he was no doubt a convict convert when it came to his faith. If a guy like that could find it in him to love the Lord, maybe there was hope yet for Kelly. She watched as James smoothed his impressive mustache. The thick fur obscured his mouth, the ends dangling down several inches past his jawline, but she thought he was probably smiling underneath. A hand fell on Kelly's shoulder, causing her to jump. "Hey there, it's okay," Long said, cupping her shoulder in his palm. He drew her in for a friendly squeeze. Every drop of moisture was instantly sucked out of Kelly's mouth. She felt like the high school quarterback had picked her to sit with in the lunchroom, and was sure she could feel the envious eyes of everyone in the congregation settling on her. "You kept the sundress," Long smiled at her. Oh my God. Kelly desperately struggled to swallow. She hoped the preacher wouldn't notice her hardening nipples. Why hadn't she realized how tall he was, or seen the tiny streaks of silver beginning to appear at his temples? Thank God he didn't have TV evangelist hair, a lacquered-up pompadour that looked like something Devo would have worn on tour. No, Long definitely had good hair, short, slightly tasseled, and not a hint of product. And boy, did he smell good. She'd never noticed it before, thanks to the funk that usually overwhelmed the strip mall church. Put the man on a mule, she thought, and you could remake a fistful of dollars. "Yeah?" she chirped insipidly. I hope that's okay." Long noted. "It's pretty." Kelly's stomach did a little flip. Across the parking lot, Curtis Rickles had limped over to join Don James and the men were talking. "Curtis," Long called, "I'd like you to get the folks started loading their bags onto the bus." Trying hard not to think too much about the warmth radiating from Long's hand on her shoulder, Kelly heard Meredith let out a squeal of glee. An instant later, the girl was capering around in front of her and the preacher. "I feel like I'm going to summer camp or something," Meredith giggled. "Father Long, you are so cool." Long gave an aw shucks grin. "I don't know about cool," he said. Kelly looked up at the preacher just in time to see him shoot a wink at Curtis Rickles. "Meredith, do me a favor, honey. Ride along with Curtis in the truck, will you?" Meredith's joyful dancing came to a stop. But I was going to sit with Kelly on the bus." I wouldn't ask, but it's a long drive ahead of us. And Curtis, he'll be all alone in that truck. Hasn't even got a radio in there. Meredith pouted. Sure be nice of you to keep him company, honey. Long's voice could have poured like thick syrup. That's a lonely drive for a man on his own. Kelly almost offered to ride with Curtis herself, as much as the man gave her the heebie-jeebies, but she couldn't get the words to come out. She watched in guilty silence as Meredith scraped the toe of her shoe on the asphalt, considering but not really wanting to play along. Okay, I guess, the girl finally agreed. Good girl, Long said. You're doing me a huge favor. I owe you one, okay? Meredith just nodded and gave Kelly a disappointed look. We'll hang out a lot when we get there, don't worry, Kelly offered. It didn't ease her discomfort about the girl being stuck with Rickles for hours on end. She knew how much the man liked to stare at breasts, and Meredith was certainly sporting an impressive pair. If nothing else, Kelly worried about Rickles' ability to keep his eyes on the road until under such circumstances. Yeah, you two will have lots of time together, Long added. For now, why don't you see if you can help Curtis load everyone's bags? Meredith frowned, but scurried off to do as Long asked. Maybe it was her imagination, but Kelly thought Rickles greeted the girl's arrival with a particularly predatory smile, albeit of the toothless variety. She tried to fight down her trepidation and concentrate on Long instead. So if the bags are going on the bus, what's in the trailer? A satisfying smile spread across Long's face. Nothing yet. Kelly wasn't sure why, but Long's touch suddenly felt ice cold. Curtis Rickles smiled as he watched Meredith walk slowly towards him. He had to admit, she didn't look too pleased about whatever Long had asked her to do. In fact, she looked like she was heading for the electric chair. But good Lord, the girl was cute, even when she was being a little resentful. Truth be known, sulking was 100% A-OK with Rickles. Hey, little lady, Rickles cheerfully greeted. What brings you over my way? Father Long says I have to ride with you, she said, morosely. Rickles felt his face flush. Thank you, Father Long. You are a good and honest man. The girl stopped several feet away from Rickles, but he made up for it by stepping closer to her. Aw, he said, instead of with your friend over there? Not looking at Rickles, Meredith nodded, a frown twisting her lips into an even more pronounced pout. Well, I know I'm not much of a substitute, but I hope you know I sure appreciate the company, Rickles told the girl, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. Meredith pulled away delicately. Rickles couldn't be quite sure if she were recoiling from his touch or just wobbling a little. He withdrew his hand, didn't want to put a fright in the young thing. I'll try to be entertaining, I promise, he said, smiling. She looked up at him, then quickly turned away. Rickles followed her gaze back to where Meredith's buddy stood with Father Long. Kelly Mills, right? The woman was a stone tramp. Father Long was right to have Meredith ride with him. God only knew what kind of filthy ideas that slut would plant in the girl's head. She would have been ready to give blowjobs in back alleys by the time they got off the bus. Rickles had pegged Kelly for what she was the first time she'd shown up in the ministry. Just another coked-out piece of trash gash. The kind of woman you could get for the price of a Manhattan or a whiskey sour. Hell, maybe even a draft beer. He'd seen hundreds of them in his day, and whether or not Kelly had decided to accept the Lord into her life didn't change a goddamn thing. The stink of Easy Tail still hung heavy on the broad, and he didn't want her to spread that corruption to Meredith Host. Curtis Rickles had a vision, and he planned to steer the girl a little differently. Not that he'd turn down a blowjob if she were to offer. Oh, no siree. But he foresaw a brighter future for Meredith, one that involved a very close relationship with him, wherein he would offer up his guidance and hard-won wisdom, a future where they might build a life together. And he'd receive plenty of blowjobs, but that was just the gravy on the biscuits. Curtis Rickles was here to make something of his life, because he had done a pretty fine job in the past of taking the opportunities the Lord sent his way and flushing them like a toilet full of turds, and he didn't figure the man upstairs had the patience with him to throw him too many more chances. Of course, He'd never had much faith in the Lord before he met Father Long. That was why he'd always been such a colossal fuck-up. As a kid, Rickles had never wanted to listen to anybody. Figured he knew better than most anybody else after all, and he sure as hell didn't want to work for a living. That's what led him to rob that gas station when he was 18 years old. Just 2 days after his birthday, 2 days into the life where he'd tried as an adult for the stupid shit he pulled, he was lucky then, and they offered to drop the charges if he opted for military service. So he'd enlisted in the Marine Corps. They didn't want him, but with some pressure from the parole board, he was accepted. Last thing he wanted was to join the damn army. If he was going to be a soldier, he was going to do it right and be a jarhead. It quickly became apparent that Curtis Rickles wasn't any better at being a Marine than he was at being a simple law-abiding citizen. He was constantly in trouble with his drill instructor during basic training, and narrowly slithered past a dishonorable discharge for insubordination. After he got out of boot camp, life in the Corps itself wasn't exactly Rickles' cup of tea, either. The first thing he knew, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and it was during Rickles' tour over in that festering shithole of sand that he lost his teeth and a chunk of his left foot. The accident had claimed him a little, and he was able to tough out the rest of his enlistment with few unpleasant incidents, aside from some drunken dust-ups here and there. With only part of a foot, he spent most of his time jockeying a supply desk, and it was tough to get into trouble unless you were dumb enough to steal from the U.S. government. When the Corps finally kicked him back into civilian life, he had walked the straight and narrow for exactly 2 weeks before he was in trouble again. Somehow he allowed himself to be suckered into a blood-and-teeth-spitting barroom brawl, and the stupidest part was that it had been over a cheap slut just like Kelly Mills. Sneering down at him, the woman had stepped over his twisted body as he lay battered and bleeding on the floor, Buck Owens warbling from the jukebox, and she walked out with the guy who kicked the shit out of him. A guy who had moments before been roughing the woman up. Things only got worse after that. He bounced in and out of a series of minimum wage jobs, finally losing his car in a pile-up while working as a pizza delivery boy. Spiraling into a deep depression, Rickles decided there was only one way to make things better, and it wasn't exactly the approach to problem-solving that God tended to smile upon. Rickles planned to blow his goddamn brains out. Scrounging up what money he could, he bought a cheap handgun from a half-assed homeboy who was exceedingly happy to be rid of the thing. Rickles figured he must have used it in a drive-by or a robbery and didn't have the sense to throw it into a river. He was walking home from the punk's apartment, the gun shoved into the back of his pants, when he met Father Eric Long. Long had hit a pothole and blown out the front tire of his car, and while he might be a real champ when it came to bringing people together and helping them follow the true path, he couldn't change the flat to save his life. The man was basically helpless, standing next to the car with the jack at his feet, lug wrench in his hand, and the spare leaning against the fender, while he stared at the wrecked tire with an expression of utter confusion. At the time, Rickles was merely annoyed by the man's uselessness, but looking back on it, he felt like it was almost innocently sweet. Figuring he should do one decent thing before ending his miserable life, Rickles stopped to change the flat for Father Long. It was the smartest thing he'd ever done, and nobody ever be able to convince him that God himself hadn't planted the two men in the exact spot at the exact time, so that Rickles' immortal soul could be saved. It started out as simple chit-chat while Rickles worked, but in short order he had found himself weeping as he spilled his guts to the preacher, confessing all his sins right there in the goddamn street, a pistol sticking out of the back of his pants, and his hands smeared with axle grease. Father Long took him out for a good meal at the Waffle House, and once the forks hit the empty plates, the two men shook hands on the deal that made Rickles an employee of the ministry of the heavenly vessel. Rickles had to admit that he was a little confused by some of Father Long's more esoteric beliefs, but he would never voice that openly, and anything the Father said was fine by him, no matter how oddball it may have sounded. And in fact, Rickles' proudest achievement as Long's good right hand was the discovery that he had made, providing the final key for the preacher's grand plan. It had certainly made Father Long happy, and the man was making good on that by sending Meredith Host to Rickles so they could become better acquainted on the long drive ahead. Reminding himself to keep his lip pressed together, didn't want to flash those empty gums at the girl again, he gave Meredith another smile. He was really looking forward to the time alone with her. "We're going to have a good time, I just betcha," he assured her. "Okay," she muttered softly, still not looking directly at him. She appeared to be a little dubious, but things would be just fine. Father Long said so, and that was almost like getting a sign from the good Lord himself. Rickles realized his palms were sweaty like a kid on his first date. This was going to be a swell trip, all right. Chapter 3. Hobb bounced off the doorframe, giving his shoulder a painful whack as he exited the hospital. His right eye was bandaged, and he hadn't been conscious long enough to adjust to the lack of peripheral vision. He paused in the open doorway, exhaling sharply through his gritted teeth. He wanted to kick the sliding doors off their tracks, but he managed to get a hold of his rage and frustration and throttle them both into submission. Besides, if he did unleash a furious foot at the doors, he'd probably only hurt himself worse. His muscles unclenching, he brought a hand to his bandaged eye and gently prodded around. The whole side of his face was throbbing painfully, a constant hammer blow timed to each beat of his heart. He felt more than a little dizzy, too. He had to be nursing a pretty serious concussion after taking so hard a hit. Fuck it. Hobbs stepped outside. The slight breeze caught the back of his hospital gown, sending a cold draft across his ass and balls. He felt his scrotum shrivel, and he grabbed at the flapping gown, looking back to see if anyone had suffered the view. There was only one person in the corridor behind him, an old man piloting a walker with some difficulty. The look on his face told Hobb the last thing he was concerned with, at his advanced age, was seeing somebody's bare ass. Turning back to the parking lot, Hobb looked around for Townsend, but the big man was nowhere to be seen. Hoping to avoid any more embarrassing gust of wind, Hobb tugged his uniform pants from the bundle of clothing he carried. He shook them out, preparing to step into them. Then he realized they were still damp with blood. Mostly Meister's, he figured, but probably some of his own as well. Opting to risk nudity, Hobbs stuffed the pants back into the bundle and then wiped his hands on his gown, leaving smears of gore. Cradling the bundle of clothes in his right arm like a soccer ball, he reached back with his left hand to pinch the flaps of his gowns together as he waited for a second in command. When he had wakened in the hospital, Hobb was relieved to find that he was alone, at least until the thought occurred to him that he might have a room to himself because the rest of his team had been annihilated. That's when Hobb had called Townsend's cell phone, holding his breath until his buddy answered. Townsend was obviously glad to hear from Hobb, but the big man's tone made it crystal clear that some shit was going down, and Hobbs' call had interrupted it. He strained to listen in as Townsend and at least two other men carried on a heated conversation, their muffled voices rising towards the end and then suddenly breaking off. Then Townsend was back on the line, quietly referring to the other men as cocksuckers, before asking Hobb how he was doing. Ignoring that particular sentiment, Hobb asked the question he dreaded hearing the answer to. Meister and Rector dead? Clark, Anderson, and Grissom wounded, but treated and released. Amazingly, there was no casualties on the strike team. The yuppies weren't so lucky, however. All but two of them had been killed, apparently willing to defend their glamorous drug-dealing lifestyle to the bitter end. Pimp for life or some shit like that. Townsend began to fill Hobb in on what had happened since the bat-wielding yuppie had hit an out-of-the-park homer with his face. But he cut the big man off and told him to come pick him up. No way in hell was he going to stay in the hospital. There were some cocksuckers out there who had a lot to answer for. Townsend's Chevy Cavalier roared into the hospital parking lot, coming to a stop at the curb where Hobb was waiting. The compact car barely contained the enormous hulk of a man, making it appear as if his muscular frame would explode from within the metal interior any second. Hobb opened the passenger door and crouched to climb in. A wave of dizziness swept over him. Catching himself against the car, he teetered there for a moment. "Need a hand?" Townsend asked. "I'm good." He closed his eyes. Well, since he wasn't sure he still had two, and inhaled deeply a few times. His left eye opened wide, and he looked back at the hospital just as the old man was clunking his way out the door. Hobb wondered if it was another escape attempt or if the old man was just out for a particularly laborious stroll. "This is going to be bare ass on the seat cover," Hobb said as he settled into the vehicle. Townsend shrugged. "It's a rental." Hobb tossed his bundled uniform into the truck, and Townsend hit the gas. The tires chewed on tarmac as they spun forwards, burning rubber smoldering in their wake as Hobb sank deep into his seat. The old man glared balefully at the racket. "It's not a prison break, for Christ's sake," Hobb griped. Townsend, his bulk pressing against the steering wheel, guided the car out of the parking lot and into the street, where it settled in amongst other vehicles in the traffic flow. With his hand held to his bandaged eye, Hobb peered gloomfully out the window. Typical Easton rural community. Lot of trees and grass between the scattered buildings. Mom and pop drugstore. Kids on bikes. I don't even know what town this is, Hobb muttered to himself. What do you remember? Townsend asked. Rector getting shot, Meister getting shot, assholes with automatic weapons that they weren't even supposed to have. Hobb squinted with his good eye, trying to get his bearings. And some yuppie fuck taking a baseball to my prettiest eye. Swung that baseball bat right at me. Are we in Silverton? Townsend shook his head. Just across the border, Lamont, Ohio, nearest town with the hospital. Hobb pulled down the sun visor and looked at himself in the mirror. The bandage covered his right eye, much of his forehead, and his entire right cheekbone. A stunning purple-black bruise spread from beneath the bandage, threatening to consume most of his face. Hobb picked at the adhesive tape, loosening the upper part of the bandage and carefully peeling it down. Oh, fuck, Townsend said, trying to watch the road and Hobb at the same time. So much for your good looks, mate. The last of the bandage gave way, and Hobb hesitantly checked out his reflection. I saw this in a horror movie once, he joked, his cracking voice giving way to the sudden hysteria he felt. The right side of his face was swollen to the point where it almost looked like another head was beginning to sprout from within his skull. The eye was pinched shut and bloated, a ribbon of clear, gooey fluid oozing from the inner corner. The baseball bat had split his forehead from underneath the eyebrow to just below the hairline. The ragged laceration was neatly stitched shut, but blood still seeped from the wound. Fucking Frankenstein, Hobb whispered. He fought down the urge to vomit and thought about weeping instead. They're stripping you of your command, Townsend said gravely, making you the fall guy. At that, he could fight no more. Frantically rolling down his window, Hobb thrust his head out as a flood of puke spewed from his stomach, streaking the side of the car like garnish, pinstriping. When the last drop of bile had passed his parched lips, Hobb choked a few times, spat out morsels of undigested food, sat back in his seat, and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and then wiped that on the hospital gown. Hobb fixed the big man with his single blue eye. What a wonderful sense of timing you have. They knew about the automatic weapons, Walt. Stunned, Hobb continued to stare at the giant stuff ridiculously into the driver's seat. They didn't. Shit, Townsend raged, lips tight with anger. They didn't think the yuppie fucks had as many as they did, but they knew. Do you think somebody set us up? It's not like that. The intel came in late. Not so late they couldn't have let us know, though. Hobbs' eye flicked up to the mirror again. He watched a bead of sweat roll out of his hairline and follow the jagged path of the cut in his forehead, finally getting lost in what was left of his eyebrow. I'm missing something here, he said. What aren't you telling me? Townsend stared at Hobb way too long, then caught himself driving onto the shoulder lane. Jerking the wheel, he brought the car back into the lane, jostling Hobb once again. Townsend kept his eyes on the road as he spoke. They deliberately withheld the information. To what end? Hobb asked, his throat tight. Exact words? We didn't want another Waco. Hobb sat in silence for several moments until he realized his mouth was hanging open stupidly. Another Waco, he snarled. Well, they sure as hell avoided that, didn't they? They got a fucking bloodbath, but at least it wasn't like Waco. We got it over with quick. I could have strangled the bastards, Walt. I probably would have if you hadn't called and insisted I come get you. Townsend's massive hands strangled the steering wheel instead, clenching it in a white-knuckled grip. They told me they withheld the info because they were worried we'd go in with guns blazing if we thought we were up against a bunch of drug dealers with machine guns. That was a beautiful plan, worked like a charm. They say you didn't respond to the situation in accordance with your training, Townsend said. That's the official version of the incident. And that's what Rector and Meister's wives will hear, Hobb fumed. No, Townsend replied immediately. I'll make sure they know the whole story. Fuck, it's probably true. Maybe the whole thing was my fault. Thing I can't figure is how the hell the yuppie bastards got the drop on us in the first place. That's where they think you were set up. Hobb looked at Townsend. And I'm taking the fall? That doesn't add up. This thing's all over the news. The agency looks bad. They need a sacrificial lamb, Townsend said. They're going to offer you the chance to resign. Said they want you to be able to go out with some dignity. How fucking civilized of them, Hobbs said. He turned back to the window, watching the scenery roll by. The storefronts and houses were dropping behind them, giving way to ranch land and open fields. He watched as a smartly dressed young girl put a galloping horse through its paces, pursued by an excited collie. "Where are we going?" "I'm taking you home," Townsend said. Hobb leaned his head back against the seat and closed his eye. Home. That was going to be a hell of a long drive. Hobb had never seen his wife cry before. It was something he never wanted to see again. Lauren already knew the strike team's operation had gone wrong. Hobb had used Townsend's cell phone to let her know they were coming, and like Townsend had said, the story was all over the news. But she wasn't prepared for Hobbs' freakish appearance. He even managed to make himself look a little weirder on the 9-hour drive home. Townsend had asked him to wear his bandage, but Hobb refused, instead mopping up the various fluids oozing from his face with paper napkins he'd collected when they'd stopped for some cheeseburgers. Pieces of paper came off the napkins, clinging to the stitches in Hobbs' forehead. Townsend had remarked that his added embellishment not only made Hobb look more horrifying, but insane as well. Hobb didn't really care. He just knew there was no way he was putting that goddamn diaper of a bandage back on his face. Seeing Lauren with tears streaming down her face made him wish he had, though. His fucked-up kisser might have had a little less impact if she had been introduced to the bandage first. She stood in front of him, weeping softly while gently bunching up the front of his hospital gown in her fist. Glancing off at Townsend, who sat on the couch trying to make his overwhelming mass seem as small as possible, Hobb wrapped Lauren's hand in his own, putting a stop to her nervous grasping. She had gathered so much of the fabric in her hands that his balls were about to make an unannounced appearance, and he felt like Townsend had suffered enough for one day. Lauren sniffled sharply, and then embraced him. She had a good 3 inches on Hobb, but she somehow always managed to make him feel like the tall one when they hugged. He ran his hands through her shoulder-length black hair and then crushed her lovingly in an embrace, luxuriating in the warmth radiating from her body. She was the only good luck he'd ever had, although it took him a while to catch on to the fact. They'd met in college, where Hobb had kicked around in boredom for a few weeks before he suddenly found he had a wild hair up his ass, and that hair wanted him to do something about his wormy little body. The hair, as many do, spoke from the perspective of one who is surrounded by beautiful, and this being college, one suspected horny, young women. Sure, Hobb had dark wavy hair, hunky Eastern European bone structure, and intriguingly out-of-place blue eyes. But once his clothes were off, he was little more than a stick figure with a hard-on. At least the hard-on wasn't as skinny as the rest of him, but that only added to his goofy appearance. It was like a beer can had been glued to a twig at an odd angle. Something had to be done. So Hobb hit the school's gym, and that's where he found Lauren. When your first impression of a girl is, "I'll bet she makes that same sound when she's fucking," you know you're in trouble. And Hobb figured Lauren was a bundle of that. He watched open-mouthed as she strained to lift a barbell laden with more weight than Hobb could have moved with the truck. Her scorching red hair, she gave up dyeing it that particular color after graduation, plastered to her pale skin with globules of sweat. She was built like a brick shithouse full of bobcats, partly from hard work but mostly thanks to Mama, and was obviously filled with nothing but disdain for the scrawny young lad gawking at her from across the room. In fact, she did little more than sneer at him the first time, but it was a sneer dripping with promise, as much as with contempt. Hobb convinced himself of this. As if this lusciously ripe model of female were issuing a challenge. Hobb began working out whenever he could, usually when Lauren was in the gym. It would take some effort to get him to admit it, but he actually rearranged his class schedule around her workouts, and that's when he wound up studying criminology. Within a month, he started peeling his shirt off before his workouts, boldly displaying the gains he'd made, minor though they may have been at the time, to his chosen mate. Then one fine afternoon, as he was performing his third set of concentration curls, he noticed Lauren standing nearby, eyeballing him with a cockeyed little grin on her face. Meeting her stare and holding it, he finished his reps, dropped the dumbbell, and wiped sweat from his brow. "Looking good," she said. Then she turned and walked away. Hobbs stared after her undulating, delectable buttocks for a moment. Then he realized he was extremely pissed off. Who the hell does she think she is, Hobbs seized. I'm okay to talk to now that I have muscles. Fuck her. Young Walter Hobbs adhered to this line of thought for weeks afterwards, during which time Lauren began pursuing him, discreetly at first, but bit by bit becoming more aggressive in her method. Each incident wherein she spoke to him only served to aggravate him more. Misguided he may have been, but Hobbs' self-assured mettle drove him to swear that the stuck-up chick would never have him. Fortunately for Hobbs, this world is full of liquor. Lying in wait for him outside his English lit class, Lauren ambushed Hobbs, inviting him to a party that very night. He turned Lauren down and blew past her, sighing in exasperation. Something had to be done. The girl was practically stalking him, and, he expected, it was purely so she could shoot him down in some cruel, devious fashion. He might have been overstuffed with confidence, but he still couldn't bring himself to believe that a super-hot girl like Lauren would pursue him so tirelessly if she weren't planning to publicly humiliate him. The party was to be avoided at all costs. If Lauren was going to be there, there was no telling what she might do. Hobbs then found himself fending off an endless stream of people wanting him to go to the party. His roommate Dave, a lanky pothead who knew some dudes who might be carrying, a buck-toothed Norwegian girl who worked in the student union building and smelled like pancake syrup. Interestingly, Hobbs had to admit. Then there were 3 guys from the film department who had latched onto Hobbs when he was the only other person in the theater for a screening of Dune, and the janitor cleaning the gym, a failed student who didn't want to leave the school, who had said, "That Lauren chick likes you." He had fought them all off and locked himself in his room, after quite literally kicking Dave in the ass to make him leave, planning to do nothing but watch TV and drink a few whiskey and cokes. Hobbs was drunk an hour later, by which time a nice moonlight walk seemed awfully appealing. Hobbs shuffled on out of his apartment, led by some mysterious force towards the direction of the campus. He didn't even see the car that hit him until he was sprawled across the hood. Actually, hit is not the quite word to describe the incident. He stepped out onto the street as the car was turning right, and therefore moving relatively slowly, got clipped in the leg by the bumper, screamed like a girl, and hurled himself on the hood. The car's driver was a local celebrity, a psychobilly rockabilly singer and part-time clerk at a porno store, who wore brass knuckles like jewelry and had a penchant for beating up pretty much everybody he crossed paths with. Needless to say, this fellow wasn't particularly pleased to have Hobbs lying atop his car and shrieking as if his legs had been severed. As Hobbs was being punched in the face for the 3rd time, another car screeched to a halt and somebody who smelled really good got out, yelling at Rockabilly Porn King to lay off. Hobbs, dazed and drunk as he was, only knew that a scuffle took place, during which Rockabilly Porn King got kicked in the balls and flopped to the pavement next to him, wheezing and gasping. Hobbs awkwardly slugged him in the head once for good measure, then began the arduous task of climbing to his feet. His sweet-smelling benefactor stepped in to help him, and the rest, as they say, is history. It was Lauren, of course, on her way to the party. Hobbs' immediate reaction upon realizing this was to puke on Rockabilly Porn King, then accuse Lauren of setting him up. Ignoring his drunken raving, Lauren pushed Hobbs into her car and took him back to her place, where she washed his face and set about soothing his fears. When he accused her of only being interested in him after he bulked up, she called him a dope. "But you wouldn't even talk to me until you thought I was, hot," he slurred. "Hot?" Lauren shook her head disdainfully. "You were hot all along. Hot's a dime a dozen. I figured the only reason you were in the gym was to pick up girls, which is why I wouldn't talk to you until I knew you had some discipline and some dedication." She threw the damp washcloth at him. "You are a dope." After that, they were only apart during the classes they didn't share. They held out and waited to get married until after graduation, for no real reason except that they felt like they should. She wanted to open a used bookstore, and Hobbs had taken on 2 jobs in order to keep their bills paid while the store was finding its feet. During that time, Lauren had been his biggest cheerleader, as he fought to get on with the agency and later helped him through the tough times when he thought he'd never get his own command. Now, he hoped, she'd help him get through losing it all. Burying his face in her hair, he breathed her smell and felt a little twinge at the rather ironic notion that he had wound up publicly humiliating her. Couldn't feel too good to have the national news spouting off about the disgraced federal officer whose ring she wore. Lauren snuffled at his chest for a second and then lifted her head to look at him. It's not so bad. She forced a little smile. Surely she didn't mean his face. He gave her a questioning look and gestured at his ugly mug. Lauren laughed, a deeply pleasing sound for Hobb in this time of need. No, I mean, that's pretty bad, yeah. Hobbs' undamaged eyebrow went up. But it's going to be a prettier picture once the swelling goes down, she said. She took a deep breath and nibbled at her lower lip a couple times. I was talking about the agency. Your resignation. Oh, that, Hobbs sneered. A career change might not be so bad, Lauren said hopefully. Something quiet. She carefully trailed a finger along his swollen cheek. Bank tellers probably only get hit in the face with baseball bats a couple times a year. Bank teller? Hobb made a show of trembling in horror. Or whatever. The point is, I don't mind so much, Lauren said. It might turn out to be a good thing. Something stung. Tell that to Rector's wife. You can't blame yourself for that, Townsend spoke up. I sure as hell can. It happened on my watch. Because somebody fucked you. The big man's eyes flickered to Lauren. Excuse me, Lauren. It's okay, Jeff, Lauren said. Townsend's eyes went back to Hobb. Fucked all of us, he hastily added. Then his gaze returned to Lauren once more. Excuse me again. Still okay, Jeff. Townsend returned his attention to Hobb. I don't think there's a goddamn thing we can do to fight 'em when it comes to making you resign, but I sure as hell am not about to let them blame you for the men who got killed. Townsend shifted uncomfortably on the couch. And I'm not going to let you blame yourself either. Hobbs' silence prompted Townsend to get to his feet and approach his friend. He lifted a ham-like fist, holding it up expectantly. Hobb made a fist of his own, and the two men knocked their knuckles together in brotherhood, a gesture Lauren never quite understood. I'm out of here for now, Townsend said, smiling. If there's one thing you guys don't need, it's a gorilla on your couch. Lauren gave him a hug, nearly disappearing within his grip. Thanks for bringing him back. What else was I going to do with him? Townsend clapped Hobb on the shoulder and headed for the door, turning to look back as he stepped out. You might want to drag him to a doctor, Lauren. He got his bell rung pretty good. She shot him a thumbs up, and Townsend closed the door behind him. Lauren looked at Hobb. I can't believe you drove across 3 states while wearing a hospital gown. Hobb shrugged. You want some food? No. You want some pants? Hobb shook his head. Nope. Lauren smiled slyly. Anything else I can offer you? What you got for sin? She took Hobbs' hand and led him down the hall to their bedroom. Townsend sighed as he swung open the door of the little car, dreading the thought of wedging himself into the thing once again. The drive from Lamont, all 9 hours of it, had exhausted him mentally and physically. His entire body felt like one big cramp. Plus, he seriously needed to take a dump. He would have done it at Walter's house, but he didn't want to subject Lauren to the horrible consequences of his lousy diet. He had to do something, though. His apartment was a half-hour drive away, and he wasn't sure he could hold it that long. Wincing, he began the process of compacting himself behind the steering wheel. Once settled, he looked wistfully at Hobbs' house. Walt was really lucky to have someone like Lauren. Hell, just having someone to go home to would be nice. Townsend considered his options. His clothes were beginning to put out a pretty serious funk, and he could use about 17 hours of sleep. But going home to his empty apartment didn't sound so good. Damn it. Was his only reason for heading home the need to take a shit? What a beautiful life. Ah, hell. The last thing he needed was to get maudlin. Sure, he was lonely, but his life wasn't so bad. Well, at least not before the mission had gone south. Still, though, some loving female company would be a pleasant change of pace. He realized he'd been sitting outside Hobbs' house for several minutes, just staring out the windshield like some kind of lunatic. If Walt and Lauren hadn't already adjourned to the bedroom, they might be peeking out at him right now, wondering what was wrong with him. He squinted at the windows, trying to see if anyone was watching. Nah, surely Hobb was taking care of business by now. Townsend knew he certainly would be, if he had a wife like Lauren. Townsend started the car and pulled away from the house. An odd howling sound emanated from his guts, a sure sign that he'd better drop a deuce and fast. All right. He had tried to force the idea down, but why the hell not? It was on the way home anyway, and who knew? Maybe something would come of it. 10 minutes later, Townsend pulled into a parking space outside Lefty's lounge. He looked at the clock, trying to figure out who might be working this shift. Could be Rita, maybe Frenchie, if he was lucky. He gave himself the once-over in the rear view, decided he wasn't going to look much better, and unfolded himself from the car. In any other town, Lefty's would have been a dive. In Jameson, it was merely everyone's second choice. Some greaseball from Richmond had opened an upscale titty bar at the outskirts of town 3 years back, and Lefty's took the hit. The trucker trade had dried up entirely, and all the best-looking girls, mostly high school dropouts with fake IDs, scurried off to find work at the glittery joint, leaving Lefty's with a handful of older gals gyrating their sagging bodies for the remaining assortment of Jameson's various sad sacks and lonely guys like Townsend. Most of the ladies had kids. Some of them even worked days at the Shop Mart department store to make ends meet, only shaking their tired money makers in the evening. It should have been a miserably sad place, and maybe it was for the women who worked there, but Townsend loved it. It reminded him of the bar Harvey Keitel hung out in Mean Streets, and that was his favorite movie. Besides, he had a favorite at the joint. Townsend pushed aside the beaded curtain that hung just inside the doorway and stepped into the club. The faint odor of mildew, buried beneath an assortment of cleaning products, struggled with the clinging aroma of cigarette smoke for dominance. Eleanor was tending bar and shooting the shit with Steve the bouncer, a man who really served no purpose since the bar's customer base had dried up. None of the men who frequented Lefty's were ever looking for trouble, but Lefty had kept Steve on the payroll because the bouncer would occasionally come by his house and do odd jobs. Townsend smiled. Looked like he was at least a little bit lucky. Frenchie was on the stage bumping and grinding with her usual dull rhythm. Shaking her ass was like a factory job for Frenchie, part of her predictable life between 6 in the evening and closing time. Townsend figured her to be on the bad side of 40, and the days when she might have given it her all in hopes of becoming a featured dancer were long past. Seeing him, she gave a little wave and a smile, motivating the 3 other guys in the place to turn towards him, wondering who had inspired such a ruckus. Townsend figured he'd better get the pressing business over with and hustled back to the men's room. The can at Lefty's always smelled like camels had been shitting there, so Townsend felt no shame at stinking the place up even worse. With the turmoil in his bowels relieved, he went back out front, taking a seat at the table close to the stage. His timing was good. The song Frenchie was dancing to was fading out, and after snatching up the $3 or $4 bills her adoring public had tossed onto the stage, she headed straight for Townsend's table, putting her top back on as she went. Townsend stole one last glance at her bare tits before she covered them up. She was holding up well, that was for sure. "How you doing, honey?" The sturdy gal purred, her voice the product of too many cigarettes and whiskey. Townsend stood, pulling the chair out for her. She smiled, always pleased by his gentle, manly behavior, and settled her agreeable rump into the chair. "Been a rough couple of days, Frenchie," Townsend said, returning to his seat. "But I can't complain too much." "Course not, 'cause I'm settin' with you." She stuck her tongue out, amused by her own joke. She was a little rough around the edges, to say the least, but goddamn did Townsend find her sexy. She still sported the fluffy 80s hairdo, like an extra from a Bon Jovi video would, and she wore thick black mascara that made the whites of her eyes look like they were glowing. She was a little bit thick in the torso, but that just gave a fella more to hang on to. Besides, her ass was enough to rock a pickup truck off its axles. Didn't matter that she probably had 14 or 15 years on him, as he had always liked the MILF types anyway. First time he got laid was with the middle-aged housewife who lived down the street, bored and horny because her husband worked too much. He had been 14 at the time. Kind of set him down on a particular path, he supposed. Besides, most of the older gals he'd slept with knew how to deliver the goods better than the younger ones. Frenchie gestured to another dancer leaning against the bar and indicated for a couple of beers. "You gotta quit this job, Frenchie," Townsend said, fidgeting with the ashtray on the table. "Why's that?" She took the ashtray out of his hands, and Townsend felt as if he was a little kid who was touching something he'd been told not to. "Because you won't date customers." She smiled at him. "Simple solution, honey. Stop coming in." Townsend leaned back as the waitress brought the beers. He paid for the drinks and tipped the girl, then waited for her to move out of earshot before speaking again. "I got nowhere else to go." Frenchie thought he was kidding. Okay, well that was chapters 2 and 3 of Friday the 13th, Church of the Divine Psychopath. I hope everybody's enjoying this so far. I will keep putting out new chapters daily. I do apologize that I'm not a professional narrator or voice actor. I'm going to do the best I can. I'm not perfect. There will be a few moments where there might be some mistakes I have to correct. I do apologize for that. Give me a like, subscribe, drop some comments, let me know what you think and what book you want me to do next. Click on the bell so you're notified of new chapters coming out. Everybody have a great day.